Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Eli Harwood. Eli is a therapist who specializes in the intricate art and science of attachment relationships, trauma, adoption, and parenting. For over 17 years, Eli has supported her clients in processing their stories, relationships, and coming into a deeper understanding of their attachment experiences, desires, and who they wish to become. Eli holds a master's in counseling psychology, is trained in EMDR level 1 and 2, uses the therapy modality TBRI, trust-based relationship intervention, and is the author of Securely Attached, a book designed to help individuals forge lasting, loving relationships. In its simplest terms, Eli's practice is about drawing people deeper into their own hearts so that they can become more fully connected to the ones who matter most: sons and daughters, spouses and parents, friends and families. So, Eli, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being
Thank
my
you for
guest.
having me. I'm so looking forward to our conversation.
I gave a brief introduction about who you are, but so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better, would you mind giving us a little bit of background about yourself and how you got to who and where you are today,
Yes.
please?
I'll give my little personal spiel first because we are all people before we are anything else, which is I am a person who was born into a family that had a whole cornucopia of unresolved, insecure things like domestic violence, mental illness, childhood sexual abuse, alcoholism, addiction. And so my journey started in a really insecure place, which I think is obviously how my passion for resolving insecure attachment began. And I eventually, through my growing up process, was given an incredible gift where my mother made a decision when I was around 9 years old to acknowledge that she was struggling with pretty serious mood disorder issues and went and got help. And in getting help, she paved the path for all of us to begin to acknowledge what was happening in our family dynamics, in our own mental health, and to begin to heal and to come up with new ways of relating and being together and understanding ourselves and our story, which led to my professional story, which is when I was coming out of college. I was actually teaching. I was teaching a private high school, and all of the kids kept coming to me during lunch and telling me about what was going on in their families. And I was like, I don't know how to help with this, but I know this is important and this needs help. And so I thought, well, I'm not going to fight it anymore. I'm going to be a therapist. This is happening. And so I went to grad school. And during my own therapy and being in grad school, I started to really dig into the attachment research. And it was in those spaces that I could really recognize, this is some of why I feel the way I feel in close relationships. This is representative of a lot of the patterns that I've developed. And these are the keys that I need to get to a place of healing. And then I have been practicing for the last 17 years with my incredible clients, and then decided to start running my mouth on the internet and started what's called Attachment Nerd, which is all my social media platforms and on my website, basically in service of helping people understand attachment and how to build secure attachments with themselves, with their children, with their partners. And then I wrote my book, Securely Attached. And now I'm here chatting with you. Everything you ever needed to know.
That's lovely. Thank you for
Yeah.
sharing. It's funny, whenever I hear about a therapist with a therapist,
Mm-hmm.
it just always seems so different to me. When did you start therapy in your journey with, I
Mm-hmm.
guess, mental health? Was it before you decided you
Mm-hmm.
wanted to be a therapist
Mm-hmm. It was
or
before.
after?
And I think that it's sometimes after for people, but for me, I became a therapist by being a client first. It was being a therapy client that really helped me to understand, like, this is a path for me as well. So I started going to therapy when I was in my early 20s, in part because of what was getting activated in my attachment relationships. I would feel fairly confident in myself in general, and then I would get close to someone and it was like this unbelievable rush of insecurity in my nervous system, and it was very confusing and disorienting, and I didn't know what to do with it. And I would feel it even with people who I knew weren't a great match for me. It's like, I know this is not enough for me, and yet this like intense urge to feel close to this person and keep them close is overwhelming me. Like, what is this and what is this about? So that's when I entered therapy for the first time.
Gotcha. Now, also your mother making the
Mm-hmm.
decision to, I guess, stop the
Mm-hmm.
cycles of everything that was happening that was
Mm-hmm.
unhealthy, I feel probably played a big part in you ending up where you are
Absolutely.
now. Um, so because you had that beginning with your mom and you started therapy and then you made a decision to be where
Mm-hmm.
you are now, how do you feel like your journey with attachment um, became more or less based on those things?
Well, I mean, I would say therapy has a huge impact on our ability to feel connected to other people in that it's a relational process. So if I'm meeting with a therapist and watching my mom go and meet with her therapist, and it's becoming this normalized thing in our family system, which by the way, it was not normalized in my mom's generation. She got a lot of shit for going to
Mm.
therapy. Like, well, why do you need to do that? Just stop feeling that way, basically. Just move on from these unbelievably depressive thoughts that you're experiencing. Um, but so she normalized it for me. So going to therapy didn't mean something's deeply wrong with me. I'm messed up. I'm weird. I'm strange. It was like, it just means, hey, I'm struggling and I could use a relational space to get support around that. And so it's this great resource to help you do that. So I think that it really helped me learn how to lean on people. That wasn't something that was totally comfortable for me. I knew how to cling to people at times, but I didn't know how to really lean in and let people see me, know me, and care for me. So I think that was a huge part of my healing, my attachment patterns and process. Yeah.
What things would you say that you learned about yourself and your relationship with attachment?
In therapy,
Hmm.
well, I learned that because my mama was not well when I was little, she was really not well. She had untreated PTSD and a serious mood disorder, and my dad is an alcoholic. And so he was pretty checked out. So because I didn't have anyone to help me regulate when I was little, I took on the role of being the regulator. So I took care of everybody else's needs and I made sure that everyone else was okay. And in doing that, I had to sort of cut off or ignore some of my very normal, tender relational needs. So there was kind of this dual development happening. There was like an external development I was doing in terms of my role. I was playing a role in my family because my family wasn't well. And then there was an internal reality that that role was affecting, which is that I wasn't ever getting to be messy and have deep needs and be authentic and be regulated by somebody else. I was performing my way forward. And so, in my therapy process, a lot of it was just about really reconciling those two things. Like, yeah, you really did take care of everybody else, and that's amazing. And also, you weren't okay. You looked okay, but you weren't actually okay. And then, I don't know, I guess the biggest discovery is the amount of grief that was present in my nervous system. I once was in a process talking about early childhood, and my therapist was helping me kind of go back into my house of origin, my family of origin house, and walk through some of the rooms. And I don't know what happened, but it was like I entered this space on the stairs by the kitchen, and all of a sudden it was like this sadness inhabited my body. And I cried so hard in my therapist's office that I had to puke in her trash can. Yeah. So I learned about myself that I was really sad and scared when I was a kid, even though I looked very confident and competent, and that both things could be true at the same time.
Duality, yes, of course. So two things. First, I love the fact that your mother modeled that going to therapy didn't mean that something was
Mm-hmm.
deeply wrong with you and kind of passed the baton for you to pick up where she
Mm-hmm.
left off. And then two, you mentioned that you were
Mm-hmm.
performing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And I think that a lot of us may not realize that trying so hard to fit in and look normal,
Mm-hmm.
and normal isn't even
Mm-hmm.
healthy for the majority of the times. Like, we are performing, we're going out into the world and saying, yes, I'm okay, yes, I feel good, yes, I have all my
Mm-hmm.
stuff together, when we actually
Yes.
don't. And to be able to recognize that, I think, was
Yeah,
huge.
absolutely. And healing. And healing. Interestingly enough, though, if you're a performer, so if you're someone who performed your way through childhood insecurity, when you start to heal, you perform less. And when you perform less, all the people around you are like, that person is falling apart. And the truth is you're actually coming together. What you're doing is you're bringing together these parts of yourself that have not been allowed to coexist. And you're feeling more authentic. And in feeling more authentic, a lot of your relationships will have to change because people have adapted to that performance experience of you. And the relationships that really are beneficial in your life will adapt along with you as you learn to accept, yeah, sometimes I'm struggling, or sometimes I feel lost, or sometimes I need help. I'm not just always in the place of having it together.
I think the people that are professional performers, that will look ugly to them,
Mm-hmm.
because there's this fear of being exposed, that you don't have all your stuff together. Like,
Yeah.
how are we going to post a picture on Instagram of us laying in bed not looking well? Like,
Yeah.
not, instead of not on a trip, or posting pictures of drinks and living our best life,
Yes.
you know?
Yes.
But I think that maybe those friends falling off as you start to heal may not be such a bad thing.
No, not all relationships are meant to exist for our entire lifetime. Many are meant to be there for
Mm,
us in seasons as a part of our development, but not as integral to it for the rest of time.
that part. Okay. Just to circle back a bit so that our listeners can have a better understanding of attachment.
Mm-hmm.
Can we define exactly what attachment is and how it's associated with relationships?
Yes. So attachment is the neurobiological drive that all human beings have to develop close relationships with other human beings. Attachment in early childhood is necessary for survival. So no baby survives without an attachment figure, right? A human being can't crawl out of the uterus and grab a piece of bark and some moss as a blanket and survive. That's not possible neurologically. So attachment is the way in which we survive through those early years of childhood, because we are borrowing the brain development of our caregiver. And our caregiver is essentially operating as sort of an external bonus brain while our brain is growing, so that we can have a longer period of time to grow our brains. But it doesn't just function in early childhood. It continues for the rest of our life. Human beings are adapted to relationships. So when we feel seen, heard, understood, in rhythm with other people, it helps us feel safe. Because even as grown-ups, if there's three of us and a saber-toothed tiger, we are far more likely to scare that tiger off. And sometimes that saber-toothed tiger is depression. And sometimes that saber-toothed tiger is you lost your job. And sometimes that saber-toothed tiger is oppression, right? Oppressive systems. We do better when we are connected to other people. And so attachment is this instinct in us to have close relationships to help us survive and thrive. But not all attachment experiences are secure. So it's like, this is an adaptation. Attachment is a human adaptation that helps us survive and thrive in life, but not everyone gets the same level of adaptation, because not everyone is born into the arms of caregivers who are secure themselves. And so if you're born into the arms of caregivers who never experienced secure caregiving, they will likely pass it down to you, unless they are cycle breakers. The kind of people that are like, I will learn this. I will learn how to be secure so that my kids experience this. But otherwise, if someone hasn't put in their work and they had an insecure experience, they're going to pass down that pattern of relating to their children. How's that for a mouthful?
That was great. I was thinking that, sometimes we may get to a point where we start to heal, or we recognize unhealthy
Mhm.
patterns or attachment styles. And now we see our parents differently,
Mm,
and we may say to them, well, I'm realizing that I didn't have
mhm,
a lot of healthy
mhm,
anything in my childhood. You did a good job, you did your
mhm.
best, but also there were a lot of unhealthy things. And now saying that or expressing those things, people may get offended because they feel like you're telling them that they weren't a good parent or they weren't a good provider. Like, what are some struggles that you see with that?
Well, I want to say this. When we recognize that we did not have a secure attachment experience growing up, telling our caregivers that is not a necessary part of the healing process. And we need to have realistic
Okay.
expectations about whether or not our parents have developed a more secure way of relating since that point in time. Because if they haven't, they are not going to be able to process that information in a way that is relational and attuned. So the irony is the more secure your parent is, the more they are going to be able to take negative feedback in a non-offended way. So if you had a really secure experience growing up, you can go to your parent and say, yeah, when you did X, Y, or Z, that was really hard and painful. Or that season, I felt totally alone. And your parent's going to be able to receive that and say, I'm so sorry. That makes so much sense. I hear you. I get that. But if you had an insecure attachment experience and you're processing that and you go to your parents and you're like, you really dropped the ball on this and this and this, they are probably going to feel affronted and offended and confused because 99% of parents do the very best with what they have. So just because you didn't have a secure attachment experience with your parents doesn't mean they didn't do everything they knew to do to give you one. It just means they didn't have the resources and the information, the mental health, the community necessary to do that. And so there's kind of this interesting desire in us when we recognize this wound to like have our parents heal along with us. And I would say that happens pretty rarely unless they've already started their own journey, unless they have already started to consider this. They're following the attachment nerd and they've called you up and said, I'm so sorry. I was not like that. I wish I had been like that. Well, yeah, maybe then they can have some of those conversations with you. But your healing process is far more about reconciling yourself to your younger selves than it is about trying to reconcile your story to your parents in the present day. Your parents are probably not going to be the people who bear witness to this pain because they will likely feel so much shame that they can't. And so instead of witnessing your pain, they will project it back at you or just shut down or kind of go martyry. I hear a lot of parents will say things like, oh, well, I'm sorry I wasn't the perfect parent. I mean, never mind the fact that I was working 3 jobs and blah, 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 blah. There's this defensiveness that comes up. And it comes up because their intention was never to hurt you. And again, I said 99% of parents because there are children who are born to sociopaths. And if you're one of those people, I see you. I know it's not the same. Your parent intended to hurt you, and I believe you. That is fucked up beyond belief. But the 99% of parents are just unable to process the nightmare that they had a negative impact on their kid. Because none of us want that.
Right. Um, Now, something that we haven't spoken about yet that can have a huge impact on attachment is trauma.
Mm-hmm.
In your personal experience, and because of your expertise, how do you define trauma, and how would you say trauma can have an effect on attachment?
Okay. I define trauma as any experience that makes you feel a level of threat or danger around your physical safety, your relational belonging, or your sense of dignity. And so it's not just being at 9/11, right? That's capital T physical trauma. There is a physicality to that trauma. There was obviously a relational element in that people caused the trauma intentionally. But overall, if you were there in the Twin Towers, your experience will be primarily capital T physical trauma. But most of the trauma that people come into therapy struggling to process and relieve is relational trauma. And as human beings, that attachment drive, that need to feel seen, heard, felt, regulated by somebody else is a core primal human need. And if you're in relationship with a caregiver who cannot give you those things, so you cry and they say, you want me to give you something to cry about, or you're scared and they laugh at you like, you're such a sissy. Oh my God, you're just such a wimp. They humiliate you in the midst of your tenderness. They dismiss you in the midst of the tenderness. They overreact to your tenderness. They become possessive. You're right. This is dangerous. We shouldn't go anywhere. We're not going to leave the house for 3 weeks. Those types of insecure reactions are traumatic to the nervous system because a child needs a caregiver who can help them feel connected and safe. And if there's nobody who can do that, then that develops in the system as a form of trauma. And so now when I come into relationships, especially close attachment relationships, like a romance or a best friendship, or when I have my own children, there's going to be this activation of some of that trauma material that as I get close to people, my body will anticipate that I am going to be whatever fill in that blank was, harmed, dismissed, humiliated, because I have now an anticipation that that's what happens in close relationships. There were a lot of people after 9/11 that wouldn't want to go anywhere near ground zero, right? Because their trauma had said, this is the place, right? And similarly, when we have relational trauma, it comes up in our relationships. So our relationships are the ground zero, if that makes sense.
Perfect sense. And the way you made it like so easy to understand, like, and the example of 9/11, like that is, like you said, big T trauma.
Mm-hmm.
But also, if we've experienced something like being humiliated by a parent or
Mm-hmm.
not feeling safe
Yes.
more than one time, those little T traumas over and over and over
Yes.
can accumulate and get heavy as well.
Preach. There's a collection. They become a big T trauma, right? So if every time I'm sad, I'm ignored, that's going to add up big time. And it's actually not only going to become a traumatic experience that I think about, it's actually going to get integrated into my sense of self. So now there's this internal narrative that says, I'm too much. I'm a burden. And now that trauma becomes a truth about me and not just a place I don't want to go in the world. Right? And that's some really complicated stuff to heal from.
Wow. It seems like the goal is always to get to a point of secure attachment. How difficult can it be to get there and maintain it in a relationship if we've had some issues in our past that have caused us to feel insecure in our attachment?
There's a lot of variables that affect how hard it will be to build a secure attachment. For instance, do you have support now in your life? Do you have people now around you that are warm and empathetic and understanding? That's going to help. Do you have any barriers? Are there barriers there? Like, for instance, do you think it's shameful to go to therapy? Well, it's going to be a lot harder to heal some of that stuff if you're not willing to reach out to helpers in the world. And then the level of trauma that you experienced. It is harder to heal from a dismissive experience. A dismissive attachment experience or an avoidant attachment experience means you grew up in a home where nobody knew how to handle feelings. And so everybody either intellectualized them, spiritualized them, ignored them, but no one knew what to do with the feelings. So everybody sort of collectively swallows feelings. That's hard to heal from, but that's not as hard to heal as an experience where your caregiver sexually abused you. Yeah, that's going to be harder. Or where you were constantly competed with by your parent. Your caregiver was threatened by you and always made you feel like you were doing things to make them feel bad. Like that type of a disorganizing experience is really hard to heal from. Who you have in your corner is going to make all the difference. So if you're going to do some healing around your attachment, I would say look around you for the people that you can tell are generally compassionate, accepting of others, warm, honest, vulnerable themselves, and slowly start collecting those people in your world and investing in them. Because as you do some of this vulnerable work, you're going to need that person to call up and say, like, I'm having one of those moments where I'm pretty convinced that I'm a piece of shit. You think I'm a piece of shit? And, you need that person on the other line to be like, no, of course you're not a piece of shit. You got into a fender bender. It happens. Did you do it on purpose? No. But I did, like, for a second, look out my window. And they're like, okay, it's okay. We all do this. I've been in a fender bender. And then you're experiencing that kind of supportive, co-regulative experience in the present day, which is helping to heal the fact that you didn't have that when you were growing up. So it kind of depends on where you are. If you live in Antarctica, I'm guessing it's harder to heal your attachment. I don't know. I don't have any actual data on this, but like just the sheer volume of people there, like, I don't know. It's probably harder to find enough people. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe there's so few people that everybody's really close and intimate. I don't know. I've never been there.
Okay, so trying to get into more of the meat and potatoes of attachment.
Mm-hmm.
Are there different types of attachment styles, and what can cause each one?
Yes. So just to make things confusing, there are actually two bodies of research around attachment. So there's a body of research by the social psychologists, and then there's a body of research by the developmental psychologists. And the word style comes from the social psychologists, and you hear that a lot, kind of like these are the three styles, and they usually say anxious, avoidant, and secure. In the developmental psychology, which is my jam because I'm most familiar with it, I trust it more, there's more longitudinal data with it, we are actually looking at a relationship, not a style. So a pattern between two people. And I think that's really important because I had a very different attachment experience with my mom than with my dad. And that's true for most people. Like they can have multiple parents and therefore multiple attachment experiences. We do tend to have one primary attachment figure, and that tends to be the pattern we most deeply internalize and we most regularly replicate. So in that way, we kind of have a style, in my opinion. But it's not a one for one. So you can have a pattern and then be with someone else who has that same pattern, and their pattern can activate a different pattern in you. So it's not boxes. I always say people don't belong in boxes. But when we look at the four patterns, we can learn a lot about generally what was our experience, what was our experience with each of the different caregivers in our lives, and then what do we need to do in order to let go of some of the insecure patterns and move into more of a secure pattern. So 4 categories. I'm going to explain the secure category first because it's what we're aiming for. So in a secure pattern, a child grows up in an environment where a parent is emotionally attuned and available. So the child learns, if I'm upset, I can reach for my parent will help me regulate, and I can receive that regulation and reset. The insecure types are insecure avoidant, insecure resistant, ambivalent, and disorganized. So the insecure avoidant is a child who grows up in a home where the caregivers are not able to effectively notice what they feel, attune to what they feel, or regulate them in what they feel. And so the child learns it's actually easier for me if I don't show what I feel, if I just swallow it. That is easier for me. And so that child learns to avoid and distract. So when emotional tenderness comes into the room, that child is going to look at the toy. They are going to fidget with their fingers. They are going to do whatever they can to look away from their caregiver in order to try to keep things as calm as possible. The ambivalent resistant child is a child who has caregivers who are intermittently there for them. So they are sometimes available and able to soothe and sometimes not. And that is confusing to the child. Now, no parent does this perfectly. So I don't ever want anyone to think like, oh gosh, that one time on Wednesday, I didn't respond to my crying kid. No, this is far more entrenched than that. There is a significant amount of non-effective responses that are patterned in the sense that there's enough of them that the child's brain says, we're playing Russian roulette here. I don't know who I'm going to get today. I might get the parent that can soothe me, or I might not. And so the child develops hypervigilance. There's an insecurity in the relationship that leads that child to feel like they must be on watch always. So even when the caregiver is soothing and responding, it doesn't actually make them feel soothed, and they tend to protest at that point. And then the last category, this part is like just breaks my heart. And I kind of want to slow down in what I'm saying about it, which is that these are kids whose parents are frightening to them. So there is emotional, physical, sexual abuse, neglect, serious drug addiction, serious mental illness. But in the other cases of insecure, the caregivers were inadequate to be a source of regulation. In a disorganized experience, the caregivers are a source of dysregulation. Let me say that again. I think I said that wrong. In the other insecure categories, the caregivers were inadequate to be a source of soothing regulation. In the disorganized category, the caregivers themselves are a source of dysregulation. So the caregiver is frightening and scary, which means I have nowhere to go when I am upset and confused and tender, because if I run towards my caregiver, I'm in more danger and not less danger. So that is obviously of the insecure categories, that is the one that is the most traumatic and the hardest to resolve, because the pattern that we want to get to of reaching for others, leaning in, letting them care for us and receiving is terrifying. Leaning in feels like the beginning of someone abandoning us, harming us, being dangerous with us in some way.
And all of this is happening at a very young age. I guess the younger you are when you're experiencing these things, the more of an effect it has on the way you have a relationship with attachment.
Mm-hmm.
Now, does it also affect brain development?
Yes. So I said this before, but the human brain is a regulatory organ, a relationally regulatory organ. So when we are developing, we're relying on a caregiver to help us co-regulate, and that is what helps us feel safe. And when we feel safe, our brain says, go ahead and grow some more gray matter. You good. We don't need to focus on the amygdala right now. We don't need to focus on that fight flight response, because there's this really safe, responsive grown-up right here who's got my back. And so because I have that grown-up there, I can learn how to color a little bit closer. I can focus on paying attention to the bugs in the window that I think are so cool. Like, I can do my math homework. If I don't feel safe in my home, so if I don't have a sense that I belong, that I am wanted, that I am cared for, that I am nurtured, well, now I fundamentally feel anxious in my body and in the world. And instead of being able to focus on those bugs, I'm having to work on regulating my body somehow. Which is making it harder to think, which we have a lot of good neuro data on this, that the children who have serious trauma in their childhood homes will often have amygdalas that are twice the size of children who grow up in a safe, secure home. So the reactivity part of the brain is doubling in physical size in a child who has relational attachment trauma. And that doesn't like shrink later. That doesn't just go away. You can rewire the brain. You can help it to heal, but like that structure is developed at that size. And so that's why it's so much harder to heal from that disorganizing, scary experience, because the structure of the brain has now evolved for survival as opposed to for connection, learning, growth, empathy, those types of things.
And I was just thinking too, so now you're basically wired to be anxious and you're a child.
Yes.
And now you have to take this backpack that you carry that's full of anxiety and try and go out in the world and function.
Yeah.
You don't know how to have a secure attachment. Like, you are going to have such a difficult experience just trying to live a quote unquote normal life. And then I think about, like kids in school with taking tests or social anxiety and all those things. It would be so much harder to be a good student because you don't even know how to feel safe in your body. So we probably have all these kids who didn't have a good schooling experience or who couldn't reach their full potential because They weren't able to
Mm-hmm.
rest.
Absolutely. And then add in any other variables, right? Like, I don't know, you're a kid of color in the US, or right now I'm just very aware of all the children in Israel and Palestine. Like, you have these
Right.
environmental traumas going on around you, systemic dilemmas and traumas on top of that. Now try to learn, right? Now try to develop, now try to grow. Like, that's going to be a lot more challenging than if you feel like I belong, I have my people, I am safe, I am understood. Well, now I can go into the classroom and someone's explaining how to solve a word problem, and I might be able to actually read that sentence with some comprehension. Um, there are some kids who academia is their refuge. So they grow up in these really terrible homes, but then they find a refuge in their academic kind of world. And so they succeed at school, even though on the inside they're still all torn up. And that's usually about some kind of a genetic predisposition. Like, those are just kids that, like, that's their jam. They were pretty much wired to be that way. But even then, those children often struggle to develop other parts of themselves. So maybe they're able to get their grades going and whatever, but they really struggle to develop close friendships that stick, or to know how to handle their emotions, or like side hobbies, sports, music. It's like all they could do is one thing. But I want to say that because you'll have listeners who are like, yeah, my family was booped up and I still got straight A's. How did that happen? Well, there was some
Right.
kind of a protective factor for you, whether it was genetically, or maybe you had access to some really great teachers and your teachers made you feel safe. And so then school actually was an easy place to feel safe. Um, and you went home, and home was where it was hard to feel safe. So, I mean, there's a lot of complexity in this, but in general, the attachment relationship is having a massive impact on what a child's brain is doing, how it is allocating resources, and what they are learning about relationships. Like, we are mentoring our children in what they should expect and how other people will treat them. So if I treat my child rough and tough and tumble, I don't prepare them for rough and tough and tumbleness. I prescribe them rough and tumbleness. I make it seem normal. I normalize it, versus if I am warm and accepting and attuned and thoughtful, I have boundaries, but I am compassionate in those boundaries. Well, now my child has that as a prescription. They expect their relationships to be healthy because they've experienced that.
That's wonderful. I mean, what a gift to be able to give a child, especially if maybe you didn't have that same
Mm,
experience, because you're, and I was just thinking about if someone is now the cycle breaker and they're
mm-hmm,
giving their child a better
mm-hmm,
experience, but as they start to heal, because the people that they came up with, or their parents, or just their family system isn't in tune with
mm-hmm,
healing, now the child may see them getting pushback for just being
mm-hmm.
healthy,
Yes,
or it may be so much more difficult to try and be a parent just because what you're trying to do and the things you're trying to change have been so ingrained
yes.
in the family system for so long that it may be cultural.
Mm-hmm,
So it may be going against your family, the family's culture and tradition. So that could be so
mm-hmm,
hard for people trying to change
mm-hmm,
these
mm-hmm.
patterns. Oh my
Absolutely.
goodness.
Absolutely. And the thing about generational trauma is it doesn't get passed down officially, it gets passed down subconsciously. No one says, I am going to stop relating to your feelings and emotions because, when your father died in the war, I just no longer could cope. And so this is why I'm doing this. No one says that. That parent just has a break of some sort and stops relating and stops giving. And then that child becomes the parent and doesn't really know why, but there's this deep and intense sense of like, there will be no feelings here. You will not have feelings, and then that gets passed down. And now someone decides to break the cycle and they're not even actually totally sure what they're breaking. They just know whatever this is not good. I know what I want it to be. I want it to be secure, but there's often not a story to make it make sense. What was it that happened? Why did this happen? Is this a result of enslavement of my ancestors? Well, I don't know, because I don't have the paperwork to go back and figure out who my ancestors were and what exactly happened to them. Is this a result of my ancestors surviving the Holocaust or lost during World War II or Vietnam, or, I don't know, because in a traumatized system, there are no stories. There are just deep edicts. Thou shalt not feel. Thou shalt not cry. Thou shalt not be angry. And so when you're breaking those cycles and you're allowing your children to have feelings, you're coming up against this almost religious sensibility in your family system of that is not what we do. But nobody knows why. But why? Why don't we cry?
Right.
Why don't? Well, we don't do that because someone might rip us apart from each other, and so we're not going to do it. Whatever. What's the generational history that led to this? I don't know. But what we do know is that secure caregiving is not dismissive or harsh or overly anxious. It's connected, it's calm, it's accepting, it's receptive.
Yes, all those. Well, because you specialize in working with parents, how do you help parents prevent repeating cycles related to their attachment stories? What are some things that you do?
Well, the first thing I do with any parent who's saying, I want to break a cycle or I want to do better with my kids, is I say, great. Tell me what it was like when you were a kid. And most people are like, I'm looking for more the solutions thing, not so much the inspecting my childhood thing. And I respond and say that is the very first step of the solutions. Because if you don't process what it was that happened to you in childhood, it will continue to remain active in your nervous system. And when your child has a meltdown about not getting a second piece of birthday cake, there will be an activation of the things that happen to you without you even knowing it. It's called a body memory or an implicit memory. And so we have to do the work to reflect and grieve and feel so that our kids aren't carrying that non-narrative emotional burden that comes from attachment trauma. After you've done that work, which, by the way, I wrote a book to do that work. So if anyone needs that book, because that's sure, lady, but how? That's what my book is about. Securely Attached is that. It's a guided journal to help anyone who wants to process their early beginnings and identify the way those beginnings have affected their attachment patterns, and then learn how to develop close relationships now so that you aren't leaning on your children. So if I don't have anybody else I lean on, I am going to transmit trauma to my kids. That's just period. Because that means I'm not being co-regulated by anybody else. There's no one else helping me feel my feels, understand myself, process my story. And so I am going to, in some way, shape, or form, have to cope with that reality. And that coping will be transmitted to my children. So you have to figure out what happened to you. What did that do in your attachment story and narrative? And then what now do you need to do in order to establish secure relationships in your life so that your children can just be your children and not your healers and not the bearers of your unresolved stuff?
With everything that we've covered and learning about how attachment can have such a huge effect on us and who we show up as in the world, I think one of the biggest things is romantic relationships, because intimacy brings out insecurity in such a huge way.
Yes.
And it may feel like if you have a difficult relationship with attachment, that finding and maintaining a romantic relationship can almost be impossible.
Yes.
But just because it feels that way, does that mean that that's something that's always the case?
No. So if you struggle to feel secure in that specific romantic relationship, it is because your attachment stuff is getting activated. Because in our childhood, we attach to our family of origin, our caregivers. That's where we have our identity, our belonging. That's who we go to when we have need, when we have specifically a tender need. But in our adulthood, we tend to do that with our romantic partners. So as you get close to someone in romance, all those feelings of do I belong? Am I worthy? Am I too much? Am I not enough? Should I shut it down? That's all going to come up there, which is why those relationships are so important in our lives. And I don't think everyone has to have a romantic relationship. You can do this with a best friend, but that sense of you're my person is where we are able to identify what has never been cared for in ourselves. And in a healthy romantic relationship, we sort of do this little reveal of those things. And we intimately let somebody in on the parts of us that we would not post on Instagram. And that process of letting somebody in is part of how we build security and intimacy. And if we're with someone who's really a good fit for our needs, they will fall more in love with us as we do that. And we will fall more in love with them as they reveal themselves to us. But it's real vulnerable and it's real tender. And if we're not ready to grieve and to be vulnerable and to learn and grow, then it will be really hard to maintain a romantic relationship.
Thank you for that amazing explanation, because it's true. The things that are buried the deepest, I feel like, get exposed
Yes.
the most when you have to
Yes.
be vulnerable. And especially if you struggle with
Mm-hmm.
attachment, it's going
Mm-hmm.
to seem like it could be super
Yes.
daunting to be able to maintain and stay
Yes.
in. So that was something that I really wanted you
Yeah.
to talk about. So
I
thank
know a lot of really confident, smart, thoughtful, successful people who, when they enter into the terrain of romance, feel incredibly small, scared, unsure, and insecure. And it's very confusing because how can I exist like this in these spaces and like this when I try to get close to somebody? And the answer is there's unresolved attachment stuff here that you need to attend to so that you can separate the past from the present. Because hi, I really like this person and I want to talk with them and they didn't call me back right away. Well, okay, your adult self can process that and recognize like they probably had a meeting or they're probably busy. Your child attachment self may not be able to process that. It's like, they don't like me. They found somebody else. This is it. This is the end. It's ending now. And so you have to be able to look back into your childhood and go, oh, well, when my dad left without an announcement and never came back, that left a mark on me. And now when anyone is non-responsive for a tiny bit, it triggers the crap out of me. But that's about my dad and that's not about, a 2-hour delay in a phone call response. My body is telling me that, but that's a memory, not about today. And so it's really when we look back that we can begin to make sense of what's happening in the present.
I think being able to connect those two things, like if you may have had a
Mm-hmm.
big event that makes you fearful in childhood, like you said, like your father not coming back or your
Mm-hmm.
father leaving,
Yes.
that's going to show up until
Yeah.
you revisit it and try to make peace with that and have some healing
Did
with
you
that.
ever watch the Casper the Friendly Ghost movie when we were growing up with Christina Ricci? Doesn't matter if you didn't, but like there's this
Mm-mm.
Casper the Friendly Ghost movie, and basically all of the ghosts, what they figure out is that the ghosts are unfinished business. And they have to figure out like what the unfinished business is so that the ghost can like pass on to the next states. And I think with our attachment wounds, we have pieces of unfinished business. What is it we haven't truly acknowledged or felt or let go of or edited? There's an editing process too. As a kid, I'm just using this example of a parent leaving, but let's say your dad left, like I described. You're probably going to interpret that as you being inadequate because you're a kid, and unless anyone else is really helping you process that, then your assumption is I wasn't good enough to stick around for. And now you have this internalized narrative that when someone doesn't respond or chooses not to stick around, it's because I'm not good enough for that. Well, that shit's got to get edited because it will get in the way of you receiving love from people in the present. And the people in the present will get real tired of trying to convince you that you're lovable if you won't let go of this narrative, because then their love will be less powerful than the wound that you had in childhood. And so we want to let the love of the present begin to take over the pain of the past. And that can only happen when we are willing to see ourselves differently, to look back and go, I was just a little kid. There's nothing I could have done. That didn't make me unlovable. Like, yeah, sure, my socks and shoes were stinky. Like, that wouldn't make me leave the kid, right? That's not enough.
That was such an amazing analogy. And I think anyone who listens to this episode that may struggle with feeling inadequate will resonate with
Good.
that. So
Yeah.
thank you for that. There's something that you talked about, the 4 A's of connection, and I saw it on one of your posts. So I wanted to ask, what are the 4 A's of connection, and how do they help children establish security and feeling loved and seen by their caregivers? And we talk about how it affects children, but also now that we've established that that child is still inside of us, I also think that even talking about that and how it affects children can also give us some insight into who we may be now if we're struggling.
Totally. Yeah. As I teach about secure attachment and what to do for our children now, what I hear a lot on the internet is like, I needed to hear that from my inner child. Like I needed to know that to help me realize what I didn't have. And how cool is that? I love the internet. Okay. So the 4 A's. The first A is we all need attunement. We need a caregiver who can recognize our internal state and connect to us emotionally. So when we're sad, we need a caregiver who can go, you're sad, I'm with you, right? And when we're excited, we need a caregiver who can be like, what? That was amazing. I love that. I'm so glad I saw you. You totally touched the ceiling. That was so cool. You know, whatever the thing is, that we are joining in an emotional state, that we're recognizing and we're joining an emotional state, because that helps us regulate and feel connected. We need attention. And I love saying this one because we live in a culture that like has this weird thing with attention. Like somehow if your kid wants attention, they're like attention hungry, and that's bad. But like all people need attention. Like we need people to pay attention to us, to notice and study us. And, you know, the power of someone telling us something about ourselves, something positive, seeing us, like, oh, that's amazing. So our kids need us to be around enough that we are paying attention to them, that we're not just on our phones, that we are here and we are watching them watch the world, and they're watching us watch the world, and we're engaging. We need affection. So we need the expression of love, an outward external expression of love from our caregivers. And that might be different for every kid. Like every kid needs a different form of affection, but like touch and I love you and rubbing up next to you, leaning heads together, expressing love outwardly. And then we also need a sense of admiration that is appropriate. And I'm going to say that like that because we don't need our parents or anybody else to idealize us. That's not helpful. Like it is not helpful to say you're a perfect kid and you do no wrong. That actually, we know from research, makes kids stumble. Because if I'm perfect now, I'm anxious because I have to be perfect all the time. This kind of admiration is more like the awe that we get in just delighting in someone else's presence. It's the type of experience that you have when you walk into the house and your dog's there and your dog is just like, just loves you, just like cannot stop, like just delighting in you showing up. And so the admiration doesn't need to be like, hey, I admire you for getting good grades. It doesn't need to be performative. It's more like, you know, when you admire something, you look at it in a loving way. Like we regard our children. They need to be regarded and sense that we are an audience, not an audience, you know, critiquing them, not an audience deciding whether or not they're worthy, just an audience that like freaking loves to show up for their show. I love to be here in the show of you, right? And when all of those things are there enough, not everyone's going to do this all the time. Like I get real annoyed at my kids at bedtime. I can't say that this is the experience they have most nights at bedtime with me. Most nights at bedtime, I'm like, okay, no more water. We're not doing any more water. Okay, yeah, no, Remy, stop. Do not put your feet on my head. We're done. Okay, I need to take a break. Mom needs to take a break. You know, I mean, so I don't want to paint the picture that like somehow we become these like Zen parents who 24/7 are offering these things to our kids, but are we doing it enough? You know, I would say every day, is there a moment at which you express that admiration and delight? Is there a moment at which you tune into what your child is feeling? You give them that attunement. Is there a moment when you are affectionate? And are you actually paying attention? Are you actually paying them the type of attention that you are paying to your to-do list, to your phone, to all of the other things in the world? Do they feel important to you? And when kids have that experience, it really helps them feel loved, lovable, worthy, calm, safe, all the goodies.
Which would then turn into them being a securely attached
Mm-hmm.
adult who has tons of gifts to give to
Mm-hmm.
the world.
Yeah, because if you grow up with this experience relationally, your internal narrative becomes, I deserve connection. I'm worthy of connection. I am lovable as I am. My messiness is not unacceptable. I am accepted. I am belonging. I have belonging, right? And so then you go into adulthood and you're not looking for validation. You're not looking for belonging. You're not looking
Mm.
for a sense of worthiness, right? The difference between growing up in a secure home and entering an adulthood, you have a suitcase full of security, worthiness, confidence. You grow up in an insecure home, that suitcase isn't filled. So you now go out into the world, and instead of being able to be like, where's my adventure? You're looking for the things you need to go on the adventure. And that takes a lot of labor and
Right.
time. And our kids are going to have to do some labor. It's not about being afraid of labor, but we don't want them to do that kind of labor. We want them to have their bags packed with all the things they need so they can go out there and make the world an even better place, an even safer place, an even richer place, and enjoy it while they do it.
Eli, I am struggling with the fact that you call yourself a nerd instead of an expert because you are an expert to me, right? But speaking about the fact that you do call yourself a nerd, you have a platform which is called Attachment Nerd. Can you talk a little bit
Yeah.
about what that is?
So I've been practicing as a therapist for about 17 years. And 2 years ago, I hit a point in my journey where I felt really deeply a need to help people prevent some of the wounds that I had been helping people heal. It's powerful to be a healer and to be with people on that end of things, but it also, after some time, it feels kind of sad. It's like, you know what? If only these parents had known this early on. So I decided I was ready to start spreading the news outside of my practice and into other places. And I started running my mouth on the internet. And that's where Attachment Nerd started, on Instagram, on TikTok, on Facebook. And so I do these little videos and I try and give tips and ideas and insights to help people understand what really matters in an attachment relationship and how to provide that for your children, for yourself, for your partners. And then I created a bunch of guides, courses, and a membership at Attachment Nerd that is specifically for parents, attachmentnerd.com, to learn all of this, to like be able to be in community and have a support, because we all need a village, but not everybody has a village. So I'm working on trying to create that village where parents can come in and be honest and be vulnerable and get support. And then I wrote my book, and I put on live workshops, and I put on in-person workshops. And I mean, basically, I'm on a very intense mission to increase the statistics of secure attachment. So right now, statistically, it's about 50-50. 50% of the population globally has a secure attachment, 50% has an insecure attachment. I want to be on my deathbed. Let's see, how old am I? I'm 41. I mean, like 60 years from now, I want to be on my deathbed at 101. And I want to know that the statistic is now 80-20, 80% secure, 20%. Like that would make me die a happy woman. So that's what Attachment Nerd is. And that's why I'm here with you.
Well, I think that you're doing enough work that hopefully when you are on your deathbed at 101, you can see
Thank
that
you. I
statistic.
hope so too.
Um, thank you for Attachment Nerd. Thank you for the work that you've done to be able to have a platform where you can share such wonderful and insightful information because it's so
I'm
helpful. It
so glad
really
you feel
is.
that way. That's like
Um,
such an honor. That's just how
yeah.
cool. Thank you.
I want to ask you one last question, and this is a big one. If you could use your platform to encourage anyone who's struggling with attachment and may not feel secure enough to talk to somebody or even feel
Mm,
their feelings, what would you say
okay.
to them?
There is a difference between feeling worthy of connection and healing and being worthy of connection and healing. Every single human being on earth is worthy of connection and healing. Not everybody feels worthy of it. So even if you don't feel worthy, even if it feels like I just got to quit my belly aching, it wasn't that bad. What's my problem? Why can't I get over it? You deserve spaces to be seen, heard, and nurtured. And those spaces, when you choose them, will be the difference between feeling like you don't deserve it and feeling like you do. Because it is in relationship that we can sense our worthiness. It is in connection that we begin to feel that we might actually not be that bad after all. We might just be human, and we might just all be in this together. And there might not be good ones and bad ones, but just those who have had the experience of feeling loved and supported, and those who have not yet had that experience. Don't give up.
Wow. There you go. That was awesome. This has been awesome. Like I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to share space with you and allow you to talk about this, because it's so important. It really is. And I think a good number of us struggle with attachment. I know I have had such severe insecurity my whole life, and I've struggled with wondering why. And now I know that it could be because my brain didn't develop properly, because my parents were struggling with their attachment, because it could have been, some generational stuff that had been passed down. So it gives answers, and it validates so many feelings and so many questions.
It is such a gift to have your caring, tender, thoughtful presence, and to be able to bear witness to you as a man, as a Black man who is holding space for tenderness and feelings. Like, that's some ballsy shit, and I'm into it.
I appreciate that so much. I do so much. I want to circle back and allow that to sink in. I received that.
I love it. Love it.
If someone wanted to find you online or on social media, where can they find you?
So my website is www.attachmentnerd.com. My coaching resource, so I have a whole group of coaches that help support people in resolving their attachment stuff and making their relationships better, www.attachmentlabs.com. And then anywhere you do your social medias, except for Twitter. I haven't never gotten onto Twitter, which I know is now called X. Anyway, everybody except X, you can find me at Attachment Nerd. And that's my handle on all those other spaces. And look forward to seeing you wherever is best for you. And lastly, my book, Securely Attached, How to Transform Your Attachment Patterns into Loving, Lasting Romantic Relationships. You can buy that on Amazon, or if you don't use Amazon, you can go to my Instagram at Attachment Nerd, and there's a link in my bio that will take you to all the other purchasing options. So yeah, that's all the goodies.
Sweet. All right. Well, again, thank you so much for this. This has been so great. I love what you do, Eli. So
thank you.
Thank you for who you are. Thank you for what you do. And
thank you for being here and being a part of it, because it's not something anybody can do alone. It's something we all do together. So thank you.